Gwini Ushla agus a card ilig, Kush an Brodul Dumsa, Ve an Shonjov, son realtas na Herden, ag an ócad specialta seo, in a Willamid le Chéile, kun an Gorta Vór, a Comora. Distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen, I'm honoured to be here today with you in Phoenix, Arizona, for the official international commemoration of the Great Irish Famine. I want to start by thanking and acknowledging all of those who have in any way helped to organise and facilitate today's event. It's an honour for me to represent the Government of Ireland here today, and I want to thank the officials from our own government present who have helped the organising committee of the commemoration. While it's a privilege to be asked to speak here today, it's also a very difficult thing to do, as I want in my few short words to be able to reflect on what exactly the Irish famine meant, what it did to those who had to endure it, and what its legacy is to those in 2019. In numbers terms, the impact of the Irish famine is incomprehensible. A country that had witnessed a population explosion from 1750 to 1800 had in a decade seen it drop by a quarter. And the drop from 1840 to 1860 of over 2 million would be a trend that would continue right up to relatively recently. But behind each one of these millions of numbers were individual stories of harrowing proportions. In many ways, those who would survive because of immigration and set the seeds for our now world-famous diaspora could, it might be argued, have been lucky compared to those who died in miserable and appalling circumstances. A report from the Cork Examiner at the time gives a very small and slight look into what the people were enduring at the time, when it referred to, quote, the walking masses of filth, vermin and disease, in hovels crowded with the sick and dying. And while thousands starved and died on the sides of roads and ditches, some made it to the institutions that the government decided at the time would form part of their response to the crisis of hunger and poverty in Ireland, namely the workhouses. These buildings were placed in provincial towns all across Ireland at the time, built off of similar plans designed to be at the very best a poor response by a completely ineffective government to the people's needs. These buildings became lasting reminders to the future Irish generations of the harrowing circumstances in which so many were abandoned to suffering. Small towns like my own native place of Newcastle West in County Limerick would have these buildings stand as an edifice in reminding us constantly of the dominating effect that the potato blight of the mid-1840s would have, not only in these small provincial towns, but as a consequence on faraway places like the United States, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. Today, while many of these are gone, the one in my own town stands intact and has a new use as a community hospital, a place of care, of hope, of compassion, of warmth, of welcome, of everything it wasn't when it first opened its doors, and when the earliest entrants, a man of 72 years of age and a girl of 9, entered it. The Irish famine didn't differentiate on the basis of geography, of creed, of age or gender. An elderly Protestant man from a city was every bit as likely to have been left starving as a young Catholic girl from a rural area. Hunger and disease did not mind who it took. And while death, starvation, disease, grief and heartbreak became the cornerstones of the personal stories of the Irish famine, there were other impacts. The neglect of the Irish people by an out-of-touch government at the time had the effect of setting the seeds of a nationalist Gaelic revival, which would manifest itself not only in the Age of Revolution in the early days of the 20th century, but would also bring into sharp focus the poetry, literature, sport, music and language of the Irish. It could be said that the tragic loss of so many in such a short time was the stimulus for the lighting of a new flame, and that flame also burned brightly in these United States of America. Because it was to these shores that so many flocked. In their droves they arrived, in many cases, with literally nothing other than a tiny scintilla of hope that this place, so far away, where they had been brought on coffin ships, with a fairly high expectation that they might not make the journey, could be only better than that wretched place from which they left. The song Ellis Island for me sums up the contrast when it refers in its opening to the opening in the late 19th century of Ellis Island, and it talks of an isle of hope and freedom compared to an isle of hunger and pain. As a people, for the many, America was good to them, and they were good to America, and that's why we're here today. And what of the modern legacy of the Irish famine, the Great Hunger and Gorta Moor? It is fitting and appropriate that the Irish government commemorates in events like this the unprecedented loss of life, suffering and immigration on a sheer biblical-like number of migrants who tried desperately to escape the claws of death. And places like this here in Phoenix are vital to those types of occasions, as they are a real, concrete, tangible reminder of this awful time in our history. But I think we in 2019 also have to push ourselves to think of this episode even more deeply. With the vastness of numbers that left our shores, their fate in many ways was literally the only thing that they took. So little wonder St. Patrick not only became their national patron, but he also became the patron to their journey. As Farmer Taoiseach Enda Kenny reminded the President during a visit at a St. Patrick's Day event, St. Patrick was and is, for many, the patron saint of migrants and immigrants. And one story more than any might help us today to sum up the desperation of those that had to leave their home place. Described by an aunt, she tells of why her nephew fled from their home place in search of a better life in the north, and wound up in a small boat crossing the sea. But the sea wasn't the Irish Sea or the Atlantic, it was the Mediterranean. And the little boy was Alan Curdy, whose picture to this day haunts me. It haunts me because he would have been the same age as my son. His little, lifeless, innocent body washed up on a Turkish shore, where a young soldier lifts him from the beach and tries to maintain Alan's dignity. An image which shocked the world, and like for so many times in the past, a photograph being a signpost to a particular generation. In this case, a reminder of how a generation has failed. Alan and his red shirt, his little navy sharp pants, and his brown shoes looked just like my son. And he probably had the same little needs: to be made safe, to be loved, to be kept warm, and to be fed. But like Ireland in the 1840s, his country in 2018 did not allow for his family to give Alan that future he deserved, like my son. And that must be the real learning of the Irish famine for all of us, as sons and daughters of Ireland. What would the millions who perished because of potato blight and the policy of a neglectful government want in 2019 for the children of today? I believe that they would want to make sure that it isn't allowed to happen anymore. So our challenge in remembering those of our own soil who died and fled is to take on the gospel of Patrick and apply it to today's world. Our country must strive to give its future generations hope, so that migration becomes something a young person wants to do, rather than something that a young person is forced to do. And it must use its place as a small, independent and trusted nation to stand up for and speak for all those like Alan Curdy, who haunts me, and it is right that he does. We cannot sit idly by while our global shores have the innocent remains of children washed up on them, or while the slaughter of the innocents in any part of the world becomes the backdrop to the evening news as we sit down to eat our dinner. The legacy of the Great Irish Hunger and the voices of those dead, our ancestors, must be heard, and we should remember them by challenging, by questioning, by pushing decision makers, and by standing up for those who have nobody, like the Irish people in the 1840s and 50s had nobody either. I often ask myself, as a descendant of those who witnessed the famine in Ireland, what must those who have survived witness? Their pain and anguish, their sense of loss, and maybe even their guilt for not being able to stop the wiping out in many cases of whole communities, is something which must have agonised them and has trickled down through the generations of Irish people. They also would want us as a nation to do more, and that's why Ireland has become the generous place that it is today, responding to world hunger and developing needs like no other country in the world, in the way we do through the United Nations. That's why these events like today, at these events like today, we can remember those who were so often described as wretched, who were abandoned to their own devices, to die or to leave, who, like little innocent Alan Kurdi, who looked like he was sound asleep after being cuddled by his mammy and daddy, we have a duty to remember. I'm a son of a woman who, as a child, remembered in 1985 her weeping in Shannon Airport as her two brothers returned to America after a family holiday. One of them, his first time since he left Ireland in 1959. Ours, like so many others, was a family that the spectre of immigration visited and left so much grief in its wake. I've cousins in this great country that I've never met, but someday I will, and shared the story of that day in 1985, and so many. And they'll learn of that little island in the centre of the world, where they, like all of us, gathered here today, can call home, a place whose children of the 19th century we remember today. I'll finish with the words of my next door neighbour and friend, Father Pat Doody, a Holy Ghost priest who ministered here in America for years. And he often signs off on community or family events with, "May the road rise to meet you, may the wind be at your back, may the sun shine warm upon your face and the rain fall softly on your fields. And until we meet again, may you keep safe in the gentle, loving arms of God." Goniena dia trocra anamica usul dilish, agus godugashe she can doiv. May all those who suffered in Gorta rest in peace. Thank you very much.